Hector or an Achilles, so that these are the references. It's no point trying to do a template of the Odyssey. That would be a futile exercise. I mean, Joyce did it, but he did it with a complete plan of, moment by moment copying of the Odyssey. My point of the whole play, of the book, is not to do it in black or to do it in Caribbean in another language and to use the figures, because none of the references are accurate, really. They're all referential, they're all accidental, and therefore they are what we have in the New World, which is a sort of half referential, half real reality. That someone, an Indian, who has lost, India by traveling across in, the Indian dispensation of arriving in the Caribbean, loses that ancestry too, and what remains is a fragmentary memory of accidents and associations. And I think that that's the description of the, not philosophy, of the cultural experience that I'm trying to describe. So that it's not a copy of, it's in no way, I think, a copy of the Odyssey to do that, because the references are not exact. They are, as I said, referential. They are associative rather than direct.
Is that a privilege that you have coming from a culture with such diverse origins, that you can draw on the association of so many different sources and so many different traditions of...
Well, in a way, it's a misnaming of things rather than a naming. So that if somebody sees a black fisherman, striding across on the sand and says, looks like Achilles, right? It's obviously not Achilles. The fisherman doesn't know that he is supposed to be Achilles or anything like that. But the reference that one has made is a carryover from a previous culture whose echoes are carried over into the Caribbean. And I think that's true of Caribbean literature as it is of Spanish-American literature, that these references, these back-of-the-head echoes, are what we try to describe in the New World. Not as it was in the Old World, but something associative of the Old World that is there in the New.
What is the African influence in your writing?
I think the African influence is in the melody of my voice. I think it's there in the music that I like. Certainly in the plays, it's very strong, because it's a society of percussion. It's rhythmic in its essence, and that in the theater particularly, I try to capture that kind of quality that is there in the pulse of the country.
When you write plays, what audiences do you have in mind? You have the audience that is going to read your dramas, but performance must be a very important part of that.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm very well educated. I read, I write. Consequently, I'm a big difference from someone who is maybe illiterate coming into the theater, if one can get them in. So that the audience that exists in these islands is not a brilliant, sophisticated audience, but it's the best kind of audience, because you have to go after it emotionally. You have to move them in the same way that an opera, which we don't understand, moves us, that they may not understand. Even the metaphors that are there, not the metaphors, but certainly the language that may be there, but they can be moved by the beat and sway and power of what you're hoping to write, even more than, say, a naturalistic, three-act play in which there's a linear kind of exposition of something which is rational. And I prefer to go after something that has more vehemence and more vitality, and even if it is not understood, but has, in the way that an opera has a visible narrative line, that you can be moved by speeches. So I have never written down to my allegedly illiterate audience. In fact, the duty to move them is stronger than if I had to do a play in Stockholm, which has happened, or a play in London or New York. I feel more of a responsibility to move these people than I feel to try to move an audience in a box-like set, in any one of these cities, in which you go into the theater and you're really in a shut box, and there's no sense of light and exhilaration and so on that I like to try to bring to my plays.
In the prelude to your collected poems, there's a passage, until I've learnt to suffer in accurate iambics. What does that refer to?
Well, that's a very early poem. And I guess what I'm saying is I'm beginning to write. And I shouldn't say anything until I've learned how to scan what I'm writing. The technique of writing, the craft, really, is master the craft and then you can say something. And that's what I'm saying to myself as early as I can.
And where did you go to master this craft?
Well, how does a poet teach himself or herself? I think chiefly by imitation, chiefly by practicing it as a deliberate technical exercise, often translation, imitation. Those were my methods anyway.
And when do you break away from the roots, break away from that tree, and become truly creative and original?
I don't think I've ever tried to be, deliberately original. I mean, there's a great thing that Pasternak said, which is something I quote often, that I'm not calling myself great. I mean, he just says that great poets don't have time to be original, which is a great remark. That what one feels one is one is part of a huge body of work that you're trying to contribute to, which is one unanimous experience called poetry, even globally and even historically, that there is a thing called poetry which is fed by different languages, and your language feeds into that, and whatever the language is, there is a limited number of good poems. There's always one small anthology of the best poetry that stays the same size for centuries, I think.
Your fellow laureates on the podium last night have a passion that to some extent has been forged and fed by struggle against injustice, by personal suffering. Is there an element of that in your writing? Do you feel a passion that is fed by your awareness of the injustices in your world and in the black world, in the African world?
Well, see, to say the African world is to confine the experience of the Caribbean strictly to Africa. I don't like that, because I think you have to include the Lebanese, the Syrian, the Chinese, all those people who, from the Mediterranean, for instance, have come to the Caribbean, or the Barbadian convict. These are all part of the totality of the Caribbean experience. The emphatic experience probably has been African, but there's an equal balance in Trinidad of, say, the Indian experience. And I think it's a duty of the West Indian writers to take in all those different cultures and manifest their experience, even if he may be African or Indian. I think there's too much of a separation that goes on now, even in Caribbean literature, of Indian, Chinese, and so on. And that really the amalgam of everything is a complete experience of everybody being exiled and arriving here and trying to do, and when I say here, I mean in the Caribbean, and trying to forge something out of it. So that the emphasis, I think, has been very African in the Caribbean, but I'd like to see more presence is in Caribbean literature of, say, that, our writers vary in color. We have some very good young white West Indian writers, all right, who shouldn't be excluded from the idea of the African so-called diaspora because they're white.
You talk about the rhythm, the percussion of Africa, of the Caribbean. Yeah. You talk about that sort of cadence that comes into your writing. Is there a continuity into the present with that you pick up through reggae, through hip hop, through a constant evolution of poetry?
Not so much poetry, I don't think. I think more music. I think there's a lot of poetry coming out of Jamaica, that kind of sort of public poetry. That goes on, like rap and stuff like that,